Hello students and welcome to today's lesson, The Curb in the Sky by James Thurber. This is the second part of the lesson and it is being presented by Dr. P.V. Geeta Lakshmi Patnaik from BJR Government Degree College, Narayanguda, Hyderabad. So students, if you remember, we have already discussed the first part of the lesson in the previous class. Today, we shall be looking at the rest of the story. So before we begin today's class, let us have a very brief recap of the previous class. As we have seen, James Thurber, who was born in 1894 and died in 1961, was an American author, cartoonist, humorist, journalist, and playwright. He's very famous for his short stories and books, especially The Dog That Bit People, The Night the Bed Fell, as well as The Seal in My Bedroom and The Middle-Aged Man on the Flying Trapeze. So James Thurber's works have been adapted into films, and some of them are The Male Animal, The Battle of the Sexes, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, etc. So Thurber was one of the most popular humorists of his time and celebrated the comic frustrations and eccentricities of ordinary people. The present story, The Curb in the Sky, is one of his better known stories, and it is often anthologized in collections of stories as well as prescribed in textbooks. So we have a few words. These are some of the most difficult words in the lesson. So let us take a very quick look at them along with their meanings. Amiable is pleasant or friendly. Anesthetic is a drug that makes a person or an animal unable to feel pain. Asylum is a hospital for the mentally ill. Call on means to pay a visit to someone. Captious means tending to find and call attention to faults. Climax is the decisive moment in a story. Curb is the edge of a footpath. Differ means to have different opinions. Flowering is the most productive part. Genuine is real, not artificial. Impetuous means acting without careful thought about the consequences. Instructive means serving to instruct, enlighten, or inform. Mannerism is a peculiar habit or way of speaking or behaving. Menace is something that causes serious damage, harm, or danger. Monomania is too much interest in or for one thing. Nuisance is something or someone that causes annoyance or inconvenience. Outlandish is strange or extremely unusual. Persuasion is a personal belief or point of view. Post haste means as fast as possible. Post hoc means after the event. Probable means likely to happen, to exist, or to be true. Raconteur means a person good at telling stories in an interesting way. Sanctuary is a shelter from danger or emotion. Screened-in porch is a covered veranda. Wear down is to make someone feel tired and less able to deal successfully with a situation. So these then, students, are some of the most difficult words in the story, and you can look at their meanings also for a second or two. So before we move on to the actual second part of the story, let us look at what we have already discussed in the previous class. So what happened so far? The Curb in the Sky by James Thurber. We have the introduction of the two most important characters, or the two main characters in the story, and they are Charlie Deschler and Dorothy. So the very first paragraph tells us about Charlie Deschler and Dorothy and how the main event in the story, which is going to be their marriage and its aftermath, is already revealed to us right at the beginning in the first paragraph. So then we are introduced to Dorothy. Charlie Deschler, first of all, wants to marry her. He tells his friends that he wants to marry her, and his friends are of the opinion that he's going to lose his mind if he marries her. So these words actually, they arouse our interest because we would want to know, the reader wants to know who this person is, who this Dorothy is, who's going to make this man, the young man who's going to get married to her, she's going to make him mad. So everybody, anybody or everybody who reads the story is definitely interested in knowing about this person. So Dorothy, even when she was quite young, when she was a little girl, was used to finishing sentences for people. When people would talk, she would jump in and try to finish their sentences. So this is definitely a very annoying habit, and most people were very annoyed with her. But then her parents did not try to control her. In fact, they were quite proud of her because they thought that their child was actually very cute, or she's very bright. And so her mother and father never tried to prevent her from annoying people in this way. And they encouraged her in her habit of interrupting people or finishing their sentences or correcting their mistakes. So by the time she grew up, she was a very, very irritating person. But then she became quite pretty. And so in the beginning, many young men were attracted to her. But then after some time, after her constant criticism or constant correcting of sentences or correcting their grammar, they would gradually begin to get annoyed with her, and they started to move away from her. And as this went on, almost all the young men who were initially attracted to her began to drift away from her. And this was when Charlie Deschler enters the story. And Charlie Deschler was an impetuous man, says the narrator. So he is the of the sweep them off their feet persuasion. It means that he is a very dashing man, and he really likes to make women fall in love with him. And so he met Dorothy, he fell in love with her, he wooed her, and he proposed to her. And when she accepted, he became engaged to her so quickly and married her so quickly that he was not able to actually pay attention to the warnings of his friends. So even though he knew that they were warning him, he thought that maybe they were warning him because they were jealous of him. So when he got married to Dorothy, he only knew that she was pretty and bright-eyed. He did not know about her annoying habit. And then what happened? So Dorothy, as a wife, came, of course, into her great flowering. So she began to correct Charlie's stories. But then the reason for Charlie being unaware of her habit before marriage is that during their courtship, Charlie succeeded in keeping her interested in his stories. As the narrator tells us, Charlie was a very widely traveled person, and he had experienced many things in his travels all over the world. And in addition to that, he was a truly excellent raconteur. He could speak very well, he could tell his stories very well. And so Dorothy was genuinely interested in him and his stories. And of course, because she had never shared any of his adventures, she did not know whether he was making any mistakes or not. And so, except for a few changes here and there in his grammar, she did not get a chance to correct his stories. And as the narrator tells us, Charlie actually spoke very good English, and so she did not really have to correct his grammar too. And that's the reason, Charlie was not able to find out about Dorothy's irritating habit. So this is what we have discussed in the previous lesson, students. Now let's continue. The narrator, now this is the narrator speaking, and let us see what he says. I didn't call on them for quite a while after they were married because I liked Charlie and I knew I would feel low if I saw him coming out of the anesthetic of her charms and beginning to feel the first pains of reality. When I did finally call, conditions were, of course, all that I had feared. Charlie began to tell at dinner about the motor trip the two had made to this town and that. I never found out for sure what towns because Dorothy denied almost everything Charlie said. The next day, he would say, we got an early start and drove 200 miles to Fairview. Well, Dorothy would say, I wouldn't call it early. It wasn't as early as the first day we set out, when we got up at about 7, and we drove 180 miles, because I remember looking at that mileage thing when we started. So what's happening here, students? The narrator says that for quite some time after they got married, he did not have the heart to go and visit them. And this was because because he truly liked Charlie, he felt that it would not be, very good for him to see how Charlie would actually come out of his dream. He was actually living in a fool's paradise when he got married to Dorothy, because he thought that she was a very pretty and a very accommodating, very amiable kind of a person. But then Dorothy is something totally different. So the narrator says that he didn't want to see Charlie coming out of his, the anesthetic of her charms, as he says, and beginning to feel the first pains of reality. So he tries to postpone it as much as possible. And finally, when he did call on him, when he did visit him, he found that things were just as he had feared. So Charlie begins to tell a story. All three of them have their dinner. Charlie Deschler, Dorothy, and the speaker. We don't know what his name is. All three of them have their dinner, and Charlie begins to tell a story about a motor trip that both husband and wife had made to some town, a town or two actually. But then the speaker says that he never found out which towns actually. That's because whatever Charlie would say, Dorothy denied almost everything. So he gives an example about how Charlie talks about this early start that they had taken and how they had, they went driving for 200 miles to Fairview. But then she says, Dorothy jumps in and says that no, it wasn't very early because it was not as early as the first day we set out. And I was looking at the mileage, she says. So it is not exactly 200 miles, it is 180 miles, she says. So she manages to correct him about the time that they had set out and also the distance that they had, traveled. And Charlie must have definitely been very annoyed and very irritated. And then Charlie will try to carry on with his story. And he said, anyway, when we got to Fairview, Charlie would go on. But Dorothy would stop him. Was it Fairview that day, darling? She would ask. Dorothy often interrupted Charlie by asking him if he were right, instead of telling him that he was wrong. But it amounted to the same thing, for he would reply, yes, I'm sure it was Fairview. She would say, but it wasn't, darling, and then go on with the story herself. She called everybody that she differed from darling. This is what the narrator says. So, as we have seen, students, in the previous slide, in the previous paragraph, Dorothy had contradicted Charlie on the time that they had set out on their trip. She had also corrected him regarding the distance that they had traveled, and now she begins to correct him regarding the place also. When he says that we had got to Fairview, she tells him that it wasn't Fairview on that day. So even though it really doesn't matter, she is intent on interrupting every one of Charlie's stories. And so what happens? Charlie's frustration knows no bounds. He is very angry. He's very annoyed. He's very frustrated. And this must have been going on for quite some time. And then after that, the speaker, the narrator says, once or twice when I called on them or they called on me, Dorothy would let Charlie get almost to the climax of some interesting account of a happening. And then, like a tackler from behind, just throw him as he was about to cross the goal line. There is nothing in life more shocking to the nerves and to the mind than this. Some husbands will sit back amiably, almost as it seems proudly, when their wives interrupt and let them go on with the story. But these are beaten husbands. Charlie did not become beaten. At the end of the second year of their marriage, when you visited the Deschlers, Charlie would begin some outlandish story about a dream he had had, knowing that Dorothy could not correct him on his own dreams. They became the only life that he had that was his own. So as we can see, students, whatever the speaker, who is a friend, who is Charlie's friend, and other friends had already feared has come true. So they knew what sort of a person Dorothy is. And even though Charlie didn't know about it earlier, before his marriage, he knows it now. So the speaker says, the narrator says that once or twice when he had called on them or when they had called on him, he could see that Dorothy had this very, very, annoying habit of allowing Charlie to get to the climax of some interesting story that he's narrating. And then from behind, like he uses a football metaphor, and then he says like a tackler from behind, like somebody who tackles from behind. She jumps on him, she pounces on him, and she tries to tell the story. So this is something which is very shocking to the nerves, says the narrator. So there are some husbands, he contrasts two kinds of husbands. He says that there are some husbands who will sit back in a very pleasant manner and in a very proud manner also. And when their wives interrupt them, they allow their wives to go on with the story. But, says the narrator, these are beaten husbands. These are husbands who have lost to their wives. And Charlie did not become beaten, he says. Charlie did not give in so easily. He kept on fighting. He resisted his wife's attempts to dominate his stories. And so, at the end of the second year of their marriage, the narrator says, when you visited the Deschlers, Charlie would begin some outlandish story about a dream. And why does he talk about his dreams? Why does he tell stories about his dreams? This is because of the very sad reason that Dorothy could not correct him on his own dreams. Because the dreams are his own, he could invent any kind of story that he wanted to. And so these stories became the only life that he had that was his own, says the narrator. So the everyday life in reality was something that he was sharing with his wife. And so he could never say anything about anything, any incident in his life, because his wife would always be ready to correct him, to interrupt him, and to finish his sentences. And so he had the only safe place that was the only safe place for him was his dreams. So he could only use his dreams, and he could narrate stories. He could pretend to narrate stories from his dreams, and thus try to avoid being interrupted by his wife, Dorothy. So there's this very funny story that he keeps talking about. Let us see what it is. I thought I was running an airplane, he would say, made out of telephone wires and pieces of old leather. I was trying to make it fly to the moon, taking off from my bedroom. About halfway up to the moon, however, a man who looked like Santa Claus, only he was dressed in the uniform of a customs officer, waved at me to stop. He was in a plane made of telephone wires too. So I pulled over to a cloud. Here, he said to me, you can't go to the moon if you are the man who invented these wedding cookies. Then he showed me a cookie in the shape of a man and a woman being married, made of dough and fastened firmly to a round crisp cookie base. So he would go on. So what has happened here, students? Charlie Deschler has become so desperate. He's trying to tell his own stories without being interrupted by his wife. And as he runs out of stories of real incidents that have happened in his life, he turns to his dreams, to his so-called dreams, in fact. So he might have had these dreams, or he might have invented these dreams. We do not know. But then there is one particular story that he keeps talking about very often, and that is about a story in which he is actually trying to fly an airplane made out of telephone wires and pieces of old leather. This is itself sheer nonsense, but then the story gets even worse. So he says that he was trying to make it fly to the moon by taking off from his bedroom, but then halfway up to the moon, a man who looked like Santa Claus but who was wearing the uniform of a customs officer waves at him to stop. And Charlie says that he was also in a plane made of telephone wires. And so when he pulls over to a cloud, when you stop a vehicle, you have to pull over. It means that you have to move to the right or the left, whichever way is, whichever side is the correct side in that particular country. And so he pulls over to a cloud, and then the policeman, or the man who looks like Santa Claus, comes up to him and says that, here, you cannot go to the moon if you are the man who invented these wedding cookies. And then he shows him cookies, or biscuits. Cookies are biscuits in America. Biscuits are referred to as called as cookies. And so he shows him the cookie in the shape of a man and woman being married. And so he says, if you are the one who has made these cookies, then you cannot go to the moon. So the whole story is sheer nonsense. And the narrator who listens to Charlie telling this story feels very sad, because he knows that Charlie is actually very slowly losing his mind, because the story has absolutely no meaning. The story is so outlandish, as he says, so unusual, so very far from truth, that it gets difficult for people to listen to a man who was so intelligent and so friendly and so charming turn out to become somebody like this. And so he feels very sorry, and the narrator is very sad that Charlie has turned out, has become, almost a madman. And then the narrator goes on. Any psychiatrist will tell you that at the end of the way Charlie was going lies madness in the form of monomania. You can't live in a fantastic dream world night in and night out, and then day in and day out and remain sane. The substance began to die slowly out of Charlie's life, and he began to live entirely in shadow. And since monomania of this sort is likely to lead in the end to the reiteration of one particular story, Charlie's invention began to grow thin, and he eventually took to telling over and over again the first dream he had ever described, the story of his curious flight toward the moon in an airplane made of telephone wires. It was extremely painful. It saddened us all. So as you can see, the narrator had just, in the previous paragraph here, spoken about how Charlie kept on telling him about a story in which he, when, you know, was flying an airplane made of telephone wires, and he was trying to reach the moon, and how he was stopped by a man who looked like Santa Claus but who was wearing the uniform of a customs officer. And this man tried to prevent him from going to the moon because he said that any person who has made the cookies for bride and the groom would not be allowed to go to the moon. And so this is a story which he kept repeating again, and he kept repeating over and over again, because this was a result of the monomania, so that Charlie was suffering from. So the narrator says that any psychiatrist will tell us that at the end of the way Charlie was going, nothing else is there except for monomania. It is madness in the form of monomania. So you cannot live in a fantastic dream world day in and day out, night in and night out, and still remain sane, he says. And so the substance that was Charlie, the young, charming young man that Charlie was, slowly begins to die out, and he begins to live in shadow. He is no longer the dashing and impetuous Charlie Deschler that we have seen at the beginning of the story. He is more like a shadow now. And at the end, Charlie's monomania leads him to such a situation where he goes on repeating the story about the flight to the moon in an aeroplane made of telephone wires. So he keeps telling this story over and over again. And as the narrator says, this was extremely painful and it saddened everybody. So this went on for a month or two. Let us read the story. After a month or two, Charlie finally had to be sent to an asylum. I went out of town when they took him away, but Joe Fulls, who went with him, wrote me about it. He seemed to like it up here right away, Joe wrote. He's calmer and his eyes look better. Charlie had developed a wild, hunted look. Of course, concluded Joe, he's finally got away from that woman. So what has happened is that after a month or two, after the narrator had spoken to him last, Charlie was committed into an asylum, into a place for the mentally ill, a hospital for the mentally ill. And so the narrator was not in town at that time, so he was not aware of it. But then his friend Joe Fulls, who was a common friend, and Joe Fulls has, he writes to him and informs him that Charlie has been admitted into the asylum. And in his letter, he mentions how Charlie's behavior has changed after he's been admitted into the hospital. And Joe writes that Charlie seems to like it up there because he's calmer and his eyes look better. So he has become very calm when compared to what he was earlier, and his eyes look better. And there is this reference to his eyes, which had a wild, hunted look. And this look is because Dorothy was so intent on correcting his sentences, on correcting his stories, that she did not pay any attention to what was actually happening to Charlie, a sensitive young man who was such a good storyteller and who enjoyed his life, has become a pale shadow. And Dorothy did not even realize that. So Joe says, of course, he's finally got away from that woman. And that woman, of course, is Dorothy. And so even in those few days, when he's freed from Dorothy's company, Charlie shows a lot of improvement. So his eyes are no longer, they no longer have that wild, hunted look. In fact, his eyes look better, according to Joe. So the narrator is very happy, and so are the readers. And then the story moves on, and the narrator says that after a couple of weeks, he drove up to the asylum to see Charlie. So let us read the story, the next part of the story. It was a couple of weeks later that I drove up to the asylum to see Charlie. He was lying on a cot on a big screened-in porch. looking worn and thin. Dorothy was sitting on a chair beside his bed, bright-eyed and eager. I was somehow surprised to see her there, having figured that Charlie had at least one sanctuary from his wife. He looked quite mad. He began at once to tell me the story of his trip to the moon. He got to the part where the man who looked like Santa Claus waved at him to stop. He was in a plane made of telephone wires too, said Charlie. So I pulled over to the curb. No, you pulled over to a cloud, said Dorothy. There aren't any curbs in the sky. There couldn't be. You pulled over to a cloud. Charlie sighed and turned slightly in his bed and looked at me. Dorothy looked at me too with her pretty smile. He always gets that story wrong, she said. So with that ends the story. So what happened in this last part of the story, students? As you can see, Charlie Deschler was admitted into an asylum. He was sent to an asylum because he had gone mad because of the kind of treatment that was meted out to him by his wife Dorothy. And in the asylum, in the initial days, he's very happy because it is a place where he has gained or won sanctuary from his wife. But then, by the time the narrator goes to see him a couple of weeks later, he finds that Charlie is once again looking very worn and thin. And the reason is very clear because his wife Dorothy is sitting on a chair beside his bed. And look at the description. We have seen how Charlie's eyes used to be hunted and wild looking, but then they became calm after he reached the asylum. And now, once again, he looks mad. And there is this description, he looked quite mad. Whereas Dorothy looked bright eyed and eager. She's so unaware of her effect or influence upon her husband. She is not at all conscious about how her behavior has, changed her husband, which is a very sad thing, of course. And so the narrator says, I was somehow surprised to see her there because he was under the impression that Charlie had won sanctuary from his wife, that he had managed to escape his wife. But then his wife has come to visit him, and once again, Charlie looks quite mad. And naturally, he begins to tell him about the story. He starts describing the story, narrating the story of his trip to the moon. And so when he gets to the part exactly where the man who looked like Santa Claus asks him or waves at him to stop, and he says he was in a plane made of telephone wires too, so I pulled over to the curb, he says, and he's about to continue his story. But then Dorothy lands in, she pipes up and she says, no, you pulled over to a cloud, she says. There aren't any curbs in the sky. So if you remember, students, in the first description of the story, actually Charlie would have said, he actually says that he pulled over to a cloud. But now he makes a slight change in his story and he says, I pulled over to a curb, and Dorothy is quick to interrupt him and she tells him that, no, there aren't any curbs in the sky. There couldn't be. So you pulled over to a cloud. So even in his dreams, she doesn't allow him to, be on his own. And so Charlie sighs. He knows that he can never escape from her. He turns slightly in his bed and he looks at the narrator with eyes full of, frustration and full of the feeling that he can never escape from this person who is his wife. And Dorothy, totally, completely unconscious of all these things, looks at the narrator and she smiles and says, he always gets that story wrong. So she's so oblivious to the kind of effect she has on her husband. And the story ends here. So this is one of the most popular stories by James Thurber. And The Curb in the Sky has been prescribed in most textbooks across the world. So tell me, students, did you like the story? Did you enjoy the story? What do you think about Dorothy? Do you think that her habit, she has a good habit, that her habit of correcting others constantly is good? What is your opinion? What do you think about Charlie actually? Do you think that he could have been happier had he not married this woman? Maybe if he had not tried to fight her domination, maybe he would have been happier. We do not know. But then there is this personality clash between the wife and the husband, and we can see how Charlie is defeated in the end. It is Dorothy who wins. So, right from childhood, she's been a person who has bulldozed all others without having any regard for their feelings or for their emotions. And so, poor Charlie Deschler, who was a very happy young man before his marriage, turns into this mad person with a monomania, and he keeps, telling people about this very stupid story, outlandish story about a plane made out of telephone wires in which he was trying to fly to the moon, and all sorts of nonsense. It is very sad that such a person, a person like Charlie Deschler, who was very charming and who was very handsome and who was supposed to be a very dashing young man, has turned into a madman. So this is the story of Charlie Deschler and Dorothy. So before we come to the end of the lesson, students, I have a very small test for you. So let us see what it is. You have two columns, A and B. So A has the difficult words here. There are 12 words here. And B has meanings of these words, but they're all jumbled up. So I want you to take 2 minutes and try to match these words in column A with their meanings in column B. So what do you have to do, students? All you have to do is look at the words on the left on, in column A. All of them are words which we have come across in the story. And these words, these meanings in the column B on the right are actually the meanings of these words, but they're all jumbled up. So all you have to do is take your notebook and just mark. You can put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, the corresponding word here. Okay, right. So, okay then, I hope you have the words. Amiable, asylum, captious, curb, impetuous, menace, monomania, outlandish, post haste, post hoc, rencontre, and sanctuary. Let us look at the answers now. So amiable is, yes, pleasant, friendly, pleasant. Asylum is here, a hospital for the mentally ill. Captious is tending to find and call attention to faults. Curb is the edge of a footpath. Impetuous is number 5, acting without careful thought about consequences. Menace is something that causes harm. Monomania, yeah, is too much interest in or for one thing. Outlandish is something strange or extremely unusual. Post haste is something, where are we? Post haste is 9, as fast as possible. Post hoc is after the event. Raconteur is a person good at telling stories. Sanctuary, what is sanctuary, students? Sanctuary is a shelter from danger or hardship. So how many did you get right? I hope all of them, students. Yeah. Okay. You can take a look at them for a few more seconds. This is just to kind of fix these words and their meanings in your minds. Now, we have another test. So you have 5 sentences here, students, 5 sets of sentences. And all you have to do is you have to choose the appropriate word from the words given here. Correcting, interrupting, telling, weaving, loses, ends, defeated, avoid, intrudes, finish. Okay. So the first sentence is, Dorothy has the habit of constantly dash people when they speak in order to correct their mistakes or to dash their sentences. Second sentence. Her husband, Charlie Deshler, loves Dash stories, but after their marriage, Dorothy starts Dash his stories. Third sentence. In order to Dash being interrupted, Charlie starts Dash fantastic tales. Eventually, Charlie Deshler dash his mind and dash up in an asylum. At the end of the story, the fifth sentence, at the end of the story, he seems utterly dash as Dorothy dash even into his fantasy world. So do you have the word, students? I hope you were able to fill in the blanks. Okay then, let's look at the answers. Dorothy has the habit of constantly interrupting people when they speak in order to correct their mistakes or to finish their sentences. The second one, her husband Charlie Deshler loves telling stories, but after their marriage, Dorothy starts correcting his stories. Third, in order to avoid being interrupted, Charlie starts weaving fantastic tales. Fourth, eventually Charlie Deshler loses his mind and ends up in an asylum. Fifth, at the end of the story, he seems utterly defeated as Dorothy intrudes even into his fantasy world. So this is basically the summary of the story, students. So if you have these sentences in your mind, then I'm sure you can write your own answers, right? So this brings us to the last task for today. These are some of the points to remember. The Curb in the Sky is a short story written by James Thurber, a famous American humorist. It tells the story of Dorothy and Charlie Deshler, a young couple who fall in love and get married. From her childhood, Dorothy has the habit of constantly interrupting other people when they speak in order to correct their mistakes or to finish their sentences. Being a very pretty girl, she attracts many potential suitors, but they soon lose interest because of a habit. However, Charlie Deshler is captivated by Dorothy and begins to woo her despite being warned by his friends about her. They get married and everything is fine in the beginning. Charlie has traveled a lot and loves telling stories, and Dorothy listens to them. Soon, however, there is a clash of personalities between the husband and the wife, and this results in breaking Charlie. In order to avoid being interrupted by his wife, Charlie starts weaving fantastical tales of dreams, but he eventually loses his mind and ends up in an asylum. At the end of the story, Charlie seems utterly defeated as Dorothy intrudes even into his fantasy world and begins to correct his nonsensical stories. So this, my dear students, is the short story, The Curb in the Sky. I hope you enjoyed it. So today I have a task as homework for you. All you have to do is write a summary of this short story. So I know that you have already read the story and you're aware of the main characters and the main events and how the story moves on and how it comes to an end. So I think it's quite easy for you to put all these things on paper. So today, just sit down, take a notebook and write the story as you remember it. So in the next class, let us discuss your written compositions. Okay, are we fine, students? So thank you for listening to me and have a good day.